And I just want to give some instructions before we start. One is that the exit is from where we came, and there are restrooms on both sides, left and right. The accessible restroom is on to your right when you stand at the exit. And water bottles are right there at the back, and if anybody needs any assistance, please, you can let one of us know. And I would now request Vivek, who's the security officer at Wipro, to just give us a few safety instructions. And just to introduce myself, I am Aditi. I am from the Azim Premji Foundation.
Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I welcome you all here. I am the location security manager here. My name is Vivek, and I am taking care of the security and safety here in Wipro for Sarjapur campus. A small basic introduction. We have one of the finest and the best security procedures that we follow here with respect to safety and security. And we have a trained set of manpower who will deal any kind of emergency if such situation arises. Please do not, if you during this course of interaction, if you have any kind of alarm or any kind of emergency, please do not feel any kind of panic. The entire support team is here, and just we'll reach you in the quickest time possible and provide you all the support possible here. So that's the only basic introduction I would like to give to you, and we are always there. So wish you good luck and have a good program here. Thank you. Good day.
Thank you, Vivek. I would now request Mr. Isaac George, who is the Vice President for HR at Wipro, to say a few words and also to introduce Dr. Susanne.
Thanks, Aditi. I just hope all of us will not have to use the luck which Vivek said wished us. Okay. Dr. Bruyere, welcome to Wipro. And all of us present here, it's really very nice to have all of you all here. My name is Isaac George. I'm part of the Persons with Disabilities Initiative for Wipro, along with Anis, who's been helping you with all the paperwork in the last couple of days. First of all, it's really very nice to see all of you here. And for once I must say that without a single reminder to attend a session, we've got at least 20% more people in the room than we thought we might have, basis all the registrations that came in, and that I think is a measure of the popularity that you enjoy, because I've not got that for my sessions. And secondly, it's nice to see many familiar faces from past meetings, and many past meetings. To me, that reflects the seriousness of intent which each one of you who is repeatedly in these meetings brings to these meetings, as well as the organizations that you represent. It's also for me a measure of the seriousness of the organizations. That's really nice to see. And as with most such meetings, it's also nice to see new people join into this journey. And that means that we have more and more organizations and more people who are backing Persons with Disabilities Initiative. That's really nice. Normally, I would have just left the introduction of Dr. Bruyere to, she's a person who is an ardent spokesperson for persons with disabilities. And I think for all of us, that's really good. But then when I saw this list of achievements and accomplishments, I said I must read this out, because I've never seen a room full of 10 people who've done as much or are associated with so many things. So just let me read this out. Dr. Susanne Bruyere is an Associate Dean of Outreach, ILR School, Cornell University, and the Director of the Employment and Disability Institute. She's also a Fellow of the American Psychological Association and current Chairperson of the Global Applied Disability Research and Information Network and Commission on Accreditation of Rehabilitation Facilities. She has been the past President of the Division 22 of Rehabilitation Psychology of the American Psychological Association, the National Council on Rehabilitation Education, and the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association. She's also a Senior Fellow at Grassroots Research and Advocacy Movement, GRAM, an initiative of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement in Mysore, India. On behalf of GRAM, Azim Premji Foundation, and Wipro, we welcome you, Dr. Bruyere. We'd really love to hear your points of view and all your experiences over the next, I think, 1 hour or so, right? All yours. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Is that better? Lower? How's that? Better? Okay. Can you see me okay if I sit? Is it better if I stand?
See you. I can see you. Yeah.
You're okay?
Yeah.
All right. I want to make this conversational, so I thought perhaps if I sat, it might be better. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's my first time in India. I've just been here a little over 24 hours, and I'm already very, very impressed and very enamored with this absolutely beautiful country. So thank you for the opportunity to bring me here. Thank you for the opportunity to have exchange with you today. I'm very grateful to our hosts. If SBYM was mentioned, and GROM, I am a fellow with GROM, and I'm very pleased to be able to meet my GROM associates this week in person. And I want to thank them as well as Azim Premji University and Wipro Corporation, whose generosity has brought me here today, as well as each of you, who I hope I will have an opportunity to have exchanges with and learn from in this couple of hours that we have together. And I've already had a little tour of Bangalore, so I know what beautiful surroundings you have, and I'm very enamored with them, and I hope to get a chance to see a little bit more before I have to leave. So I'm here today, as you know, to talk about people with disabilities and why we feel strongly that they should be a part of the workplace, that they have a place there. So my overview in the time I have with you today, which will be about 45, 50 minutes, because I want time to talk with you as well, is to talk about why that's important, why each of us are here today, and why it's important not only to us and to other colleagues in India and the US, but around the globe more generally. I want to share with you some research from Cornell University, which is where I come from in upstate New York, and specifically talking about employer practices, which is what's part of the research that we focus on in my own research focus, and specifically around hiring, keeping, advancing, and really making people with disabilities feel included in the workplace, and our role in that. Each of us here, whether you are coming from the private sector, from companies, or you're a disability advocate, part of an NGO community, or whether you're here from the university, we each have a role in making this happen. So I want to speak to each of those audiences because each of us needs to contribute to this very significant agenda. Let me first put myself and my work in context. I want to talk a little bit about Cornell and the ILR school, which is the department from Cornell that I come from, and the Employment and Disability Institute, which is my academic home. As you can see, Cornell is in this little tiny place in upstate New York. It has 25,000 people, and that number doubles when the students come, about 55,000 people. We have many more cows, many more deer than we have people in this very rural, very beautiful, but very rural community. But we're a global organization. We have a medical college in Doha, Qatar. We have a campus in Rome. We have students all over the world. So it's very much a global institution. This is what it looks like, the campus. You can see it's very beautiful, but it's very rural. We are on a lake, many trees. This is summer. In the winter, that is all white because we have lots of snow in the winter. There's another picture, more of a spring picture, so you can see it's a very beautiful place. It's not very old by comparison to universities in Europe. It's only was initiated in 1865. There are 3,400 courses, 14 different colleges of study, about 21,000 students, 1,500 faculty. So it's a good size, but not enormous by US standards, but it is a very strong institution academically. It's among the top 10 universities in the US, which we're very proud of course. The ILR school, ILR stands for Industrial and Labor Relations, and this is a college that was developed after World War II to deal with workplace conflict. It is a workplace of the college. It focuses exclusively on that, which is why it's a wonderful home for this work around people with disabilities. It's a tiny college in that it only has 100 academics in it, half of whom are focused on teaching the students inside the university, half of whom are focused on teaching professionals, companies, unions, advocacy organizations outside. We have about 900 undergraduate and about 100 graduate students. And the topics of focus, which is why it's a good fit for us, is labor relations, law, history, human resource studies, international labor, economics, organizational behavior, social studies. So you can get a flavor of what this is all about. Within there, within this ILR school, we have an Employment and Disability Institute, which is where I come from. It's about 40, 50 years old, so it's been around a long time. It started looking at community-based programs for people with disabilities as small businesses, but has been focused in the last 20 years really pretty much on non-discrimination and workplace policy. And we have 40 staff, it's very multidisciplinary, and we support ourselves through grants and contracts. So that's a little bit about the background of where I come from. Moving on to our content for today, why disability is an area of importance. I think if you are here, you probably know, but I like to share a few statistics about why we think it's not only our issue, but it's a global issue. So I'll share some statistics. I'll talk about the disparities we know from the data that we're gathering that are still there, why it's a critical issue. And even if it weren't a critical issue because there's so many people who we need to absorb in the workplace, it's a critical issue for the private sector because we lose people we don't need to lose to disability and health conditions, people who are already in the workplace. So we need to think about that, think about accommodation, so we keep seasoned workers and we keep older workers in the workplace. They can work a lot longer than we are affording them an opportunity to when we don't accommodate. And we also know from some of the research that we do that when we integrate people with disabilities into the workplace, like as we address other diverse populations, people with disabilities help us. They're a great litmus to show us whether or not we truly have an inclusive environment. When we include people with disabilities and when we do a good job of it, we do a good job for the general workforce, the general population. And there are other challenges for us of why disability is important. Many of you may be aware, we now in the last few years have a UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I see some heads nodding. And that means that each of us now have a mandate that we didn't have before to try to address these issues. So it's important for us to think about it for that reason as well. And I can tell you in the US, many of our multinational countries want information from the experience like I will be gathering in my few days here in India, because they have companies in other countries and they're not quite sure how to navigate inclusion for people with disabilities in other countries. So I'm here to learn about what you're doing, how you're doing it well, so I can carry that back to our countries, because they need to understand how to carry out that mandate of inclusion for people with disabilities when they go abroad, to have companies abroad. We also want to see people with disabilities included in mainstream legislation, so that's part of what many of our countries are dealing with. We're going to focus here today on the importance for employer practices. We'll talk a little bit about policy, but employer practices is where we're going to focus. So, what are the compelling statistics that make us think that this is an important issue? We know that globally now, and the source of this information comes from many places, so rather than citing all those different places, I'm just going to tell you it's in the World Report on Disability, and that's where we're taking these statistics from. But 1 in 7 people across the globe amounts to about 1 billion people with disabilities. So this is a huge part of our global population that we want to make sure get included and are productive in the workplace. Although we have that figure, I can tell you that data on people with disabilities is difficult to find in many of our countries. We have better data in the US, far from perfect data, and that data tells us that 1 in 7 may be a conservative figure. 1 in 7 is the minimum. More than likely it's more 1 in 5. And as we have an older population, we know that number will be increasing. I'm finding if you have a younger population than in the US, we have many more older people, and I can tell you that we're going to have a hard time keeping them in the workforce unless we understand the principles of inclusion and accommodation that people with disabilities allow us to begin to learn about. We also know the majority of people with disabilities are living in developing countries and they live in rural areas, so it's sometimes quite remote, so we need to think about strategies to also give them an opportunity to be included in the workforce. It will be a different strategy. We know from US data and the data that we've looked at from other countries that not only do we have many people who are people with disabilities, but those people are differentially disadvantaged where employment is concerned. In the United States, I'll use our data, the employment rate of people with disabilities in this data is now a couple of years old, but it's still these figures only unfortunately slightly change. About half as many people with disabilities are in the workforce as could be as the general population, 36% compared to about 77%. And I'm just looking at the 21 to 64-year-old group. We have many more older people staying in the workforce who will be acquiring disabilities. And this translates to many more people who are in the poverty level, people with disabilities, than those without disabilities. 25, almost 27% compared to about 11%. So it translates to many more people living below the poverty line, household incomes much lower for people with disabilities because they don't have equitable access to the workforce. Employment rates globally are not much different than this. In fact, in some countries, the numbers reported are, although it's not systematically available, because they can't be captured in the informal economy, but we do know from those countries that we can gather that data that the parallel is very similar. The range is anywhere from as low as the figures in the US, 30 to 38%, to highs of 81 to 92% of people with disabilities in some countries do not have employment. We use the employment rate rather than the unemployment rate because we feel it gives a better picture, because when you look at unemployment rate, it usually measures people who are looking for work. And we know that many people with disabilities get discouraged from that. They aren't even trying, so they wouldn't even be counted in the unemployment rate number. So that's why we use employment participation rates. And we know that even if we get people into the workforce, there are discrepancies that continue that we want to address, which is why we talk about retention, advancement, and inclusion, not just initial hiring, because people with disabilities commonly earn less than their non-disabled peers. And we know that women with disabilities are even more disadvantaged. Often their employment participation is less and their wages are less than men with disabilities. So these are things for us to be aware of. We think it's important for people with disabilities to participate in the labor market because we are maximizing human resources more broadly. We are using all of our human capital, and we need to do that to be productive as societies, to be productive in business. But it's also, we believe, a right for each individual to promote their individual human dignity. It contributes to social cohesion. So it's not just a concern for people with disabilities, it's a concern for each of us. It contributes to the well-being of individuals, but general society. And we know that with an aging workforce, we're going to need to do this anyway. I always like to have this conversation with companies because many of us have very seasoned talent we want to keep. And in many of the countries, we know that their workforces are aging. That may be less true in India. You can tell me more about your own country. The numbers I have would suggest you have an older workforce, but in talking with some colleagues on my way here, you have a large proportion of young people coming into your workforce. But in many countries, this schematic here is a percent change over a 15-year period in the 55 to 64-year-old group in the workforce, and in the general population, as you can see. Many countries have a significantly higher proportion of older people in their population, and so we're worried about how do we keep them productive in the workforce. We don't lose them off to Social Security, which can be an economically difficult social structure for countries to accommodate, so we want to keep people productive. The strategies that we're going to talk about today are not only good for people with disabilities, but they are also effective strategies for an older workforce as well. Some of the barriers on getting people with disabilities into the workforce initially are access to training. People with disabilities disproportionately are kept from getting good training opportunities. Lack of access to other needed services like transportation, etc. Misconceptions about disability and outright discrimination. And I'm going to share with you some of the data from the US about discrimination that tells us that we certainly have problems. I think they're not unique to us, but I have the data to share with you, and perhaps as I share that, you can reflect upon the situation in India and share with me your observations about how discrimination in the workplace might be occurring here. So I said one of the barriers is lack of access. That can be young people with disabilities often lack access to formal education. I can tell you when we have as a partner in the United States the Society for Human Resource Management. That's our national organization, professional organization for HR managers in the US. We have over 200,000 members. I'm just learning about the fact that you have an HR professional association here in India, and I'd like to at some point get a chance to speak with them about their experience as well. But they tell us the #1 problem they perceive for the people coming in that they interview is having adequate preparation and similar preparation to the rest of the people who are competing for those jobs. We know we have a problem there. They also tell us that attitudes are an issue. So even when people get into the workplace, there are attitudinal issues to deal with. But formal preparation, there may be disparities. Physical access to employment, it could be that workplaces are just not accessible. We still have those problems in the US. We know that in many other countries, getting to the workplace, getting access to the workplace is difficult because of physical access or the cost of transportation or availability of transportation. Particularly if people have mobility impairment, sometimes sensory impairments, it makes it difficult for them to get to that workplace even when they get the job. Inaccessible workplaces. It can be getting to the job, but it can be once you get on the job, getting into the office. And maybe even if you can get to your desk, you may not be able to get around the rest of the campus. I see this magnificent Wipro campus. It's huge. My guess is it might be difficult to navigate. Many of our campuses and our corporations are wonderful. They're big, but they can be difficult to get around. So it can be that a person might get to their office, but they're not truly included because they can't get to the social, they can't get to the cafeteria, they may not be able to find out, network with other colleagues about other jobs. So workplace access, inaccessible information. It's not enough to just have physical access to a workplace. Many of us find our jobs online now. Many of us are recruiting exclusively through websites. So having an opportunity to look at jobs and within the workplace to use the internet to relate to colleagues, to get information from corporate headquarters, to access your benefits online. Many of us have all of those services that are given to employees online, and they may not be accessible to people with visual impairments or sometimes people who can't operate kiosks. So that's an important part of workplace access. And lack of access just to funding in informal economies where people are not working in workplaces and working more as self-employed people or working in the informal economy, getting access to microfinancing might be the impediment that they're most likely to face. We also have barriers in terms of misconceptions about people with disabilities. In many of our countries, one of the first things we are having to deal with to make a difference is to change the thinking about people with disabilities, that they are less productive. We know in some of the research that we have done that that is absolutely not true. People with disabilities often are very ingenious about how to accommodate themselves, which gives them great transferable skills for problem solving and decision making, and they are very hardworking because they're very happy to have that opportunity and they want to prove themselves. Ignorance or prejudice is particularly great we find around mental health disabilities. I'd be interested to hear from you if you believe that's true in this country as well, but we certainly know in the US and in most countries around the world, psychiatric disability, mental health disability, there's a great deal of prejudice, stereotypes about having people with mental health disabilities in the workplace, a lot of fear around that. And some of these misconceptions mean that people with disabilities themselves are impacted by that societal vantage point, and they absorb these low expectations because of that. So we not only need to work on the workplaces and on society, but instill in people with disabilities a sense of their own self-worth, because that's the key to them being able to execute that productivity we've been able to see them actually do when given an opportunity. Another barrier is discrimination. Employers' misconceptions about capabilities that I just mentioned. Employers may not wish to include people with disabilities in the workforce for a whole host of reasons. They may feel that society has biases, that they're worried about how customers will perceive them. They may be concerned, and our own HR managers, as I mentioned, have said that to us. They may be concerned about their supervisors, what they will think, how they will deal effectively or not so effectively with people with disabilities. And they may also be concerned about the coworkers and their perceptions and how they will respond to people with disabilities. And as I just mentioned about mental health, different impairments elicit different degrees of prejudice. Sometimes there is prejudice around not only mental health that I mentioned, but some invisible disabilities like epilepsy. There are concerns, stigmas about certain disorders that are higher than others. So it may mean where a company gets successful with bringing in a person with perhaps a visual impairment or a physical disability. There may be other types of people with other types of disabilities that we need to do more work about educating so we're more inclusive across the board. I talked about discrimination more broadly, and to make this real, discrimination is a very broad word. I want to give you some illustrations from data that we're collecting in the United States as a discussion point for us, because I'd like to hear from you how discrimination might manifest itself in India and how we can work together to try to address these things. But in the United States, we have had disability rights legislation for the federal sectors and for some employers since 1973, but in general with our Americans with Disabilities Act for about 20 years, since 1990. So we've collected data from our enforcement agency, which is the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, since the employment provisions came into law in 1992. So we have data over about 15 years at Cornell. This is part of the research that we do to examine discrimination. From 1993, which was the first full year it was collected, to 2007. In those 15 years, we have about almost 500,000 charges just on disability. This doesn't include charges for other types of discrimination, for other protected populations. And the data includes two things that we find very useful to take a look at. One is the trait of the person upon which the discrimination occurred, so the types of disabilities, and the issue, the discriminatory behavior. What part of the employment process, which I know many of you are human resource professionals, so I think it's interesting for us to understand where in the employment process people perceive discrimination is occurring. These are people's perceptions. These are individuals who are filing charges. And there's lots of other information like age, sex, race. We look at some of those things. The employer, we have information about the employer, and there's case-specific details, but in the time we have, I'm just going to give you a very big picture, because I think it gets us thinking about the poignancy of these problems in our own workplace. First, I want to tell you, it's interesting, when we looked for a number of years at just the sheer numbers of people with disabilities filing claims, and the number was low compared to gender and compared to race and ethnicity and compared to age. But when we started looking at per 10,000 people in the workforce, we realized the problem is significantly larger than that of other populations. So when we look at the different statutes, and the first one is disability, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that's that red one, compared to the next one is yellow, and that's racial, ethnic, or gender and age, which is those two at the very bottom. There are many more people with disabilities filing charges about discrimination than any other population. So we see this as an indicator that there is much more work to be done around discrimination for people with disabilities than any other population. That means that we won't relax on the others, and when that problem can be compounded when you have racial, ethnic minority and a person with a disability or a woman, as I mentioned. But we do know that we have problems in America around discrimination, and people with disabilities are telling us that from filing the number of claims they are proportionately. And this has not changed over time. Over the 15 years that we look at, you see we have not fixed our problems. The numbers continue. And here are where we are having problems. So hopefully this will help you think about in your own workplace, whether you are bringing people in or whether you have people, incumbents with disabilities in your workforce, where are your own issues? But we know we have it, sadly, I mean, this is the types of disabilities, the impairments. We have a large number that are not categorized, so they're our largest number, 26%. But the next one, and this is an anomaly in this data, this is not an impairment, but it is housed in this way, they classify the data, is they also talk about retaliation as one of the causes or bases for filing a charge. So it's not just a disability, but it's a part of what the person experienced. And this is heartbreaking to me, that retaliation is 13%. It's one of our largest. It really says that employers do not understand that people have rights, and that when people try to exercise their rights, they are perceiving that the employer comes back at them. So that's something we need to change in our workplace culture. So then the next highest is physical mobility. If I combine orthopedic back impairment with non-paralytic and put those two together, it's about 1 in 5. So many people with mobility impairments are experiencing problems. Depression and other psychiatric disability, if I put those together, that's about 10% of our impairments. That's quite high. And then we have in our legislation, this is unique to our legislation, is that 10% here you see regarded as disabled, because it could be the case that the person doesn't really have a disability, but because they may have an uncommon gait or an uncommon look, the employer perceives they have a disability. And in our legislation, if they can prove that they were denied a job or released from a job, and it was on the basis of the employer's perception that they had a disability, even if they don't really have it, they may be protected by this law. So that's why you see some people are actually using that to protect their rights. Then the others are less, but significant. And that is we have 4% diabetes, 4% heart, cardiovascular, 3% hearing impairment. I think those are significant because for us, these are disorders that come on later in life. And we're seeing many more older people in the workforce who may have diabetes or heart conditions or even loss of visual or hearing acuity. And employers are having a hard time with this. They are not accommodating. People are losing their job because of that, and they're being dismissed, and people are filing charges to protect their rights under this law. Places in the employment process, and again, any of us who work in human resources, this is important for us to think about. And this is true for other protected populations as well. This probably won't surprise you, but over half perceive alleged unlawful discharge as the reason. So these are people who are in the workforce already, and they feel that they've been pushed out of the workforce disproportionately because they have a disability. So it's a part of the employment process we really need to look at. Are we releasing people with disabilities differentially, disproportionately to other people when we have layoffs, when we downsize companies? 1 in 5, our law requires that employers accommodate, and that means that if a person needs a special desk or special software, and they can be equitably productive because they get that accommodation, they have a right to that. If they perceive that they asked for it and it was reasonable, it wasn't related to their disability and appropriate for the job, and they were denied it, these are the bases within which this person would have filed a claim, and that is 1 in 4 of our claims in this data. And then some of the others, terms and conditions of employment. They may feel that there's a pay disparity or other differences that they're not being afforded. It could be access to other opportunities in the workplace, perhaps benefits. And then we see here again some of the issues that relate to workplace culture. They feel they've been harassed, 12%, disciplined disproportionately or discharged disproportionately, or not had equitable access. There's 4% here to promotions, or disparately laid off. Hiring is less. It's less than 10%. But this is significant, I think, because it is still almost 10%. And hiring disparities, hiring discrimination is very hard to prove. It's hard for a person to prove that they went to the workplace or interviewed and not hired because of disability. So I think that's why we see that that number is lower. I also like to show this because, again, for us in the U.S., we have an aging workforce, and we see that this is impacting how the charges are being filed. We see that increasingly there are more older people, 55 and above. That's that green line on the bottom. You can see it slowly inching up, where our younger workforce, 16 to 39, are not proportionally filing as many charges. And it could be that we have an aging workforce. It could also be, I'd like to think that maybe it may be that we are educating our young people with disabilities. Perhaps we're doing a better job with them. Maybe they're having less trouble. Wouldn't that be a wonderful reason why this data is reflecting the way it is? We certainly are working hard to educate young people with disabilities and getting them into the workforce. So I'm hoping we're doing a better job, but I also think it's because we have an aging workforce that we're seeing more claims in the older group. So, with that, I'd like to move on now and talk a bit about what we can do better. You've heard all the problems, all the reasons why we should be addressing this issue that we're all collected here today to talk about. And here's what we're trying to understand at Cornell. How can employers, who I think, if they understand why this is good business, what they can do to retain their current workers who incur disabilities, but bringing new people who have never had an opportunity, that they will do that. I think a lot of it is education. You are a prime example of well-meaning employers here today, people who really want to understand and really want to make a difference, and I believe they're out there. I think we just need to get the information to them, and that's why discussions like this are really exciting to me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing, how we've been gathering information to try to identify best practices so far, and what we've learned to date, and share that with you. And then hopefully we'll have time to talk a bit about what you're doing, because that's what I'm here to hear. That's my personal reason to be here today. We've worked, I mentioned, with our Society for Human Resource Management. I think it's critical for us to draw from professional associations that represent the interests of business and our touch points in the workplace. We also work with a group called the Disability Management Employers Coalition, and this is a group of employers who are particularly concerned about keeping people in the workforce. It's disability management. That term in the United States means using good practices to keep people, once they're incumbents, in the workforce, healthy, retain them, minimize absences, keep people productive, focused, ability to really, able to be in the workplace and really be productive there. And we're working with some small business organizations because small businesses have unique things to consider. And we've done research, we're doing research with each of these groups. We've also had, and I'm sharing some of the results with that, is we have two groups we've worked with. The Center for Advanced Human Resource Services Studies at Cornell University's own campus, which is high-level HR managers, HR VPs, and also the Conference Board. And we'll be able to meet with Conference Board companies, member companies here in India later in the week, which I'm quite excited about. But the Conference Board has 2,000 employer members, and we've taken some of their top executives and had some meetings with them to get from them what they think are best practices. And we're doing some case studies in private business organizations. Hilton is one. We're also working in the federal sector because our federal sector is eager to be a model employer, and we're working with some federal agencies as well. So, here are some of the ways we've learned that increase recruitment and hiring. And I'm going to give you a broad, big picture, and then I'll come back and present some discrete data from our human resource studies. First of all, we are savvy about diversity initiatives in most of our countries now. Most of our companies, we know that a diverse workforce is a key to success, and we know that true inclusion, not just diversity, is really what we should be striving for. So we think a natural way to start moving the disability agenda is to begin to talk about disability as a part of our ongoing, our existing diversity agendas, and are encouraging our employer partners to do that, or learning from them for those who are progressive that are doing that already. We know that one of the issues employers tell us is finding qualified applicants with disabilities. And the companies that are doing the best with that have established relationships with non-governmental organizations in their communities. I know some of you represent NGOs here today, and that's very exciting because that's the beginning of that partnership. So that we know is a key to success of finding qualified candidates. Partner up with your local non-governmental organizations that represent employment and training for people with disabilities. We also know that many young people, very talented young people with disabilities, may not be affiliated with these NGOs. They are young people because of family support, because of good luck, because they are incredibly bright, are in universities, are in professional training programs. They come out, they have great credentials, and they don't get jobs because of discrimination. So we are encouraging employers, and many of our employers are doing this and teaching us, to begin to recruit from the universities and colleges they already go to, but don't just go to the career office, go to the office that supports students with disabilities, because you will not find those highly qualified, very talented young people unless you affirmatively reach out for them. And they belong, they have a right to be in that pool of candidates from your top universities, as well as the other young people who more naturally find their way to your doors. Don't miss that as an opportunity to recruit these people who have the right credentials. They are prepared to go into your workforce, but they disproportionately are disadvantaged when they go out seeking work. So we want you to meet them halfway. We know another way that helps prepare young people with disabilities, but it also is dramatically changing workplaces, is to give your workplace an infusion on disability by bringing in young people with disabilities for internships. It can be during the year, or it might be in the summer, but what we see is that supervisors' attitudes change, co-workers' attitudes change, when they become acculturated to a person with a disability who is enthusiastic, who wants to learn, who can help. They demonstrate that competency, and employers the workplace naturally changes. We see that when these internship opportunities are afforded young people, they get excited about the workplace. They are your potential employees for the future. They're great advocates for you in the community because they talk up that experience that they've had as an intern, and your workplaces change. It is a low-cost, low-threat way to really bring knowledge about disability into your workplaces and to give some young people very needed work experience that they wouldn't otherwise have. We also see disability awareness training for recruiters. Recruiters, and it can be people who 100% are recruiters, or it could be your hiring managers or supervisors in particular departments. They are your front door to the job market. And so it's important to give them this information. They perhaps are the ones who should be seeing these student interns in the summer, or going out for you to these universities, and you say to them, don't just go to the career offices for our engineers, for our accountants. We want you to be talking to the Disability Services Office too. We want you to affirmatively reach out. They need to understand that. So it needs to be a part of their training, a part of their expectations, a part of their performance appraisal. It should be built into how we tell them that they're doing a good job. And companies can send the message strongly to their communities that they're committed to this, to their NGOs, through corporate social responsibility. We see more companies now putting disability on their corporate social responsibility agenda. It may be supporting employment and training NGOs, great partnership there, because again, your people, your employees who are a part of your CSR agenda begin to see disability as a desirable quality that they should be considering in their workplace. It could be fundraising, it could be doing training programs, affording job interviewing to to young people with disabilities lots of ways to demonstrate your commitment to these issues through your corporate social responsibility agenda. We also encourage, best practice is beginning to keep organizational metrics on recruitment and hiring and on advancement and inclusion. And I'll talk a bit more about that. I'm going to show you some examples of that in a minute. And another piece, and this is something we've only thought about more recently because some of our employer partners are doing a great job at this and they've taught us this. In the United States, we have another employer group that I didn't mention that we partner with called the U.S. Business Leadership Network. And the USBLN is an organization that is a group of employers who are committed to disability issues, and they are now creating a certification process. We have one for ethnic racial minorities, we have one for veterans, but we've never had one for people with disabilities. Our Small Business Governmental Association hasn't done that yet. So the USBLN has taken it on. They are certifying small businesses with people with disabilities so that they have more credibility when they go out to try to sell their services to corporations. So it's important for you as employers, I know many of you have subcontractors. What this means is make sure your subcontractors, not just you, but your subcontractors are affirmatively recruiting people with disabilities, or if you have an opportunity, preferentially give small businesses who are made up of people with disabilities your business. Give them an opportunity to compete for these subcontracts. That's what we're speaking about here. It's another way to make a difference in your community. So, with that big picture list in the backdrop, here is some of the research that we have drawn that from. I mentioned we've done 2 surveys with HR managers, with HR professionals. 10 years ago, we did one with our Society for Human Resource Management. We went back and did an updated, more current survey in the last 8 months with the Society for Human Resource Management in the U.S. And here's some of the results of our studies. This is what our HR professionals told us that they're doing and what they're not doing around these good practices that I just mentioned to you. A large proportion of them, 60% say that they include people with disabilities explicitly in their diversity and inclusion plans. So we were pretty happy about that. And this is about 600 people who responded to this study. So, about 2/3, that's pretty good. Still a third are not doing that, but we've got to start here. They say require their subcontractors. I talked about supply chain. 2/3 of them are saying that they're beginning to require subcontractors to also affirmatively recruit. They, almost 2/3, almost 60%, said they train their HR staff and their supervisors on effective interviewing for people with disabilities. And in the U.S., that means you do not ask about disability unless the disability is obvious and the person is applying for a job where it may be that you perceive that the disability could perhaps be a problem. So you may ask in a very general way. In this way, you don't say, what's your problem? You don't say, is your disability going to be a problem? What you say is, these are the requirements of the job. Can you do this job with or without an accommodation? So you focus on competency. You focus on the ability to do the job. So it doesn't come naturally to many of our supervisors, to many of our recruiting people, so we need to educate them. Many people feel awkward. They don't ask the question at all, or they may ask it very awkwardly. They may alienate the person, but it also, sometimes they don't ask, and then the person never gets a chance to explain. They just never get called back. They don't get the job. So we want to give people the chance to ask about that, but ask in a way that's polite, that doesn't create the perception of discrimination, but gives the supervisors the chance to get the information. Am I not loud enough? I think it's not working. Oh, just get some. Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
All right, thank you. We want to give them the opportunity to be able to ask correct questions so they get the information they need, so that person gets called back in second interviews and gets a chance at that job. Has a relationship with community organizations. Again, here it's still a little bit better than half. but where our numbers are going down here. It has relationships with community organizations that specifically promote employment of people with disabilities. And a little less here, but still 47% actively recruit people with disabilities. And again, we're still talking about recruitment and hiring, so we're going to talk about retention and advancement, but we're still thinking now here, the front end of the employment process has senior management that demonstrates a strong commitment to disability recruitment and hiring. It's going down, 40%. So it's less, but still 40%, that's good. But I can tell you this, and when we've asked about the number one thing that makes a difference in companies and about culture change around disability, the number one thing is a statement by the top CEO that disability is important to that organization. So although this is somewhat encouraging, you know, 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5 are doing it, it's not enough, because it's the most important thing to have your CEO articulate that disability is going to be a part of the diversity agenda, that disability is where your corporate social responsibility is going to focus, that people with disabilities are going to be in your workplace in equitable numbers is the number one thing that's going to make change in your company. So if you want to make change in your company, get that message to your CEO. They need to articulate this as an important part of your mission, your company agenda. So we have work to do in the US there. Next, takes advantages of tax incentives for hiring people with disabilities. And I don't know anything about this in India. Do you have tax incentives for hiring people with disabilities in India? You do? Okay. And some tax exemptions. Okay, good. I'll be eager to learn more about that.
Not an exemption. It's the government refunds your central provident fund.
You get some funding back if you've hired.
The provident fund that is contributed by the employer is refunded back.
Excellent.
The
Okay.
scheme is not very well known. Yes.
And that's a problem, isn't it? It's a problem for us as well. Okay, that's interesting. So I want to learn more about that. That's great. I'm hoping I can get more information about that. Because as you can see here, it's not well known in the U.S. It's a quarter of our companies say that they use these tax incentives. Now, part of it is larger companies don't tend to take advantage. Smaller companies are more likely to do it. They need the funding. But many companies just don't know about it at all, as you're suggesting might be the case here. And again, we see less now. Less than a quarter has explicit organizational goals related to the recruitment of hiring of people with disabilities. And what did we just say? It's real important that someone at the top is saying, this is something we're going to do. Participates in internships. And here I'm very disappointed because, as I mentioned to you, that's one of what we're finding in companies that do it. It's a big culture changer if you do these internships. But our companies, not as many are doing this, only 20%. Includes progress towards recruitment and hiring of people with disabilities and performance appraisals of senior management, fewer yet. So we want to get those into, that's a big driver. If you send the message to people that they're going to be held accountable, it really changes their behavior. So we need to get it into our reward scheme for managers and for our higher level executives. So when I mentioned that metrics are important, here's examples of metrics, how we can use metrics to hold ourselves accountable. We can do so in the sourcing, in the interviewing screening process, in the hiring process, in how we evaluate people once they're in, and we do it all along the line. If you're how many of you are keeping statistics now on how you're doing with your populations? We all do, don't we? Sometimes we do it better than others, but we look at who are we hiring, where are we hiring from? So we want to look at the proportion of spending on recruitment of employees with disabilities by their source, the proportion of overall recruitment spending on employees with disabilities compared to other population, the proportion of applications that we get. If we don't get any applications, it means we're not doing that recruiting. So we need to be looking at those numbers. The average spending per applicant by source, the proportion of number 2 here, interviewing screening, proportion of total interviews of people with disabilities, the proportion of people with disabilities interviewed by the hiring manager, by job level, by business and functional unit, so that we can begin to look where we're succeeding and where we're failing, and reward those units that are doing a good job of this affirmative recruitment. And hiring. It's not enough to get a pool, although the first step is getting a pool, second step is getting them interviews, but then how many are actually making it into your workplace? So hiring proportions, and we could look by unit, by manager, by the source. So that tells us something about the NGO. A part of this is an evaluation that you can make of your NGO. What kind of candidates are they getting us? So NGOs, be aware, I'm telling the employers to hold you accountable in this way. You know, are we getting qualified candidates? Are they making it into the workforce? And then how are these candidates doing? So we want to look at how are people with disabilities rated? And we want to look at how are they rated compared to their non-disabled peers, because we want them to have equitable evaluations. We don't want them to be disproportionately discriminated against, or you know, we don't want them to be thought less productive just by virtue of discrimination. But we also want people with disabilities to be equitably held accountable to be productive. We don't want them to be just kept on the job because they're a person with a disability. So we really want to look at how we're evaluating people. So next part of the employment process we're going to talk about is retention and advancement. Regular and consistent performance management, the same thing any of us as HR professionals know is important. We need to do it consistently, but it's also true for people with disabilities. Regular reevaluation of accommodations. We use the term accommodation. Do you use a similar such term? When you give people an adjustment, you use accommodation. Effective disability case management. I talked about disability management for incumbents, and that's what this is about. That is when you're losing somebody to the workforce because of a disability or a chronic illness, how you support them back makes a big difference in terms of how quickly they return. It helps with absence management, and we know that's an important part of keeping people in the workplace once you get them there. Making sure that career opportunities are accessible. Do you have print materials in Braille or on audio cassette? If your job promotion opportunities are online, are they accessible to people with visual impairments? Can people find out about them? Do you provide professional development and training to your incumbents with disabilities and equitable opportunities? We hear from people with disabilities that they're passed over often. They don't get the opportunities in the same numbers as other people. So we want to make sure we're thinking about people with disabilities when we give opportunities for training, advancement, when we give special assignments and project work. Maybe holding this in a way that's making it crackle. An opportunity for formal and informal mentoring. Is it because I have both of those on? It's battered.
Yeah.
Thank you. Formal and informal mentoring, facilitating group team project opportunities. That's the way each of us advance, right? We're given an opportunity to try a new skill, to prove ourselves. We want to make sure that our incumbents with disabilities get that opportunity as well. And, as we talked about with hiring, keep metrics on retention and advancement. In the same kind of way, what proportion of people are advancing through your opportunities for promotion. And here's what our HR professionals told us about those things. In these workplaces, for our HR professionals who responded to our survey, they said 3/4 of them have a designated office or person to address accommodation questions. So this has told us that this is something to tell other employers, that 3/4 of these professionals say this works for them. They have a designated office or a person to address accommodation questions. If a supervisor says, I got a request for a special piece of software or a desk adjustment, or it could be an absence for some kind of therapy, what do? They need a place to go to safely share their questions and not feel silly. So you want someone who is designated to help with that. Allows an employee to exceed the maximum duration of medical leave as an accommodation. This is a very common request in the United States, and 3/4 of our HR professionals here said that that's something that they do. requires training for supervisors on legal requirements of disability non-discrimination and accommodation. Many of our employers do that, 3/4 of them. I think sadly less of them do that kind of training for inclusion. Most of it is compliance oriented. At least they're doing it. At least they're talking about rights and responsibilities. That's good. Has an established grievance procedure to address accommodation questions. I think it's interesting that about 70% have that. So they're building in this mechanism, this administrative mechanism to problem solve. Evaluates pre-employment occupational screenings to ensure that they are unbiased. I see this more as a front-end thing, but it was included in this part of our survey, so I've kept it here. And that is, many of our jobs require medical screening. And we want to be sure that if medical screening requirements are there, it's not just being done for people with disabilities. That's discriminatory in the U.S. You cannot do that. If you're going to apply a medical screening requirement, it has to be done for all people, not just people with disabilities. Other things related to accessibility and accommodation. Provides advance notice to job applicants that reasonable accommodation are provided during the job application process. So almost 2/3 said that they do this. They let people coming in know that they will provide an accommodation. About half said that they have a formal decision-making process on the provision of accommodation on a case-by-case basis, which is what our law requires. Less 30% regularly reviews the accessibility of online application systems to people with visual, hearing, finger, dexterity, and cognitive impairments. So it's not just, we most often think about visual, but using computers need some of these other kinds of skills, so we could be discriminating against people with cognitive impairments, people who can't access the website because of fine motor dexterity, disabilities. And we know we can redesign websites so that you can toggle through the website using certain keys. So that can be overcome even if you have fine motor dexterity issues. Has a centralized fund, company-wide fund to provide accommodations for people with disabilities. Fewer, about 20% or 1 in 5 had that kind of provision for accessibility and accommodation. So I talked about metrics and the retention process, and here's for advancement, opportunities for training, and are we losing people with disabilities where retention is concerned disproportionately? And taking a look by unit, by supervisor, by unit. Is this occurring in a particular place because you have an uninformed supervisor or a culture that is not inclusive in a particular unit? So it helps you to zero in and target areas in your company that might need more support, more help, more education in these things. And similarly, keeping proportional information on advancement opportunities for people with disabilities. So I want to talk a bit now, that's the big picture about employer practices. That's, if we were doing all of that right, that would be terrific. I'm not saying that those aren't important things, but I think we are now at a point where we're learning that it's not enough. So we're already thinking about the next step, and that is once you have people in the workplace, what can we do to make that person really feel included? We hear from people with disabilities, they get in, but they're still marginalized in terms of really feeling like they have opportunities to advance, they have opportunities to socialize, to really be a part of the fabric of the organization. We think it's critical to now talk about that, examine that. There are benefits, we feel, of inclusive climates more generally. Everybody benefits from these kinds of considerations. We know that people with disabilities experience less inclusion. Our research has told us that. We've done surveys within companies. People with disabilities are not feeling as included. They have better experiences in inclusive environments, and there are qualities, characteristics in those environments that we know make a difference. And they are particularly advantaged if they have high-quality relationships with their managers. They really do well if their managers take an interest in them, give them these opportunities. And interestingly, it's not just a function of the manager relationship, but when the manager sends the message to the rest of the unit that this person is an equitably capable individual, co-workers treat that person differently. So that supervisor's message about that person, that relationship is critical because it not only affects that relationship, but it affects that whole work unit and how they treat that person with a disability. So it's really important to get to those managers. Here's what we know, and this is research of one of my colleagues that I'm working with now is a person who's not a disability person by background. She's an industrial organizational psychologist. I asked her to partner with me because she has very unique skills in measuring workplace climates that I did not have, that I needed, I felt we needed. And this is her research on more generally on diversity. She's a diversity expert. And she tells us that the data shows that members of historically marginalized group, and that's women, that's ethnic racial minorities, that's people with disabilities too, and now we're looking at aging workers, they experience less discrimination and overall better work experiences in what we call inclusive units. The demographic-based differences we know in experiences of fit, perceived fairness, harassment, engagement, perceived organizational support that are commonly seen, that we know these populations more often experience, they disappear when the climate is an inclusive climate. And that's good for companies. That's good for business. That's good for productivity. It means that these people experience higher cohesion. That means that there's better information exchange. There's less conflict. There's less miscommunication. It means they're more creative. And that means companies benefit because you've got a better working work group. And it means higher financial performance. So we want more inclusive climates. We want climates that manage diversity in this inclusive way. So we took those principles and we begin to take a look at how do people with disabilities, and we survey the whole company, so we catch people with disabilities in the net of perceptions of everybody in that company. And what we find is that people with disabilities in general do feel disadvantaged, not as included. They feel that they have less fit between their skills and the demands of their job, so they're not getting the right job match in the front end. That's very important for any of us to really use our talents well. There's less a sense of empowerment on the job than their non-disabled peers, less perceived organizational support, lower levels of perceived procedural and interactional justice during the accommodation process. Doesn't feel fair to them. Their work arrangements, they perceive to be less fair. Lower quality relationships with managers. Managers' behaviors appear to be less inclusive, and that means they're less likely to feel a sense of commitment and job satisfaction, which often means less productivity. They're not necessarily, their turnover, what we call turnover intentions, is not necessarily higher. These people tend to stay on the job, which is both good and bad. Good for the company in that they stay there. Bad in that they're staying with their heart not in it, because this is what they're experiencing in that workplace. And we want them to stay, but we want them to do so feeling fully engaged. We want that for every member of our workforce. So here's how it's different if that's an inclusive unit. People with disabilities in inclusive units have greater success at getting their accommodations granted, greater coworker support of this accommodation. It's important that coworkers support it. Better experiences of what we see as procedural justice and interactional justice. Lower levels of disability harassment. That's good because that's what these claims of discrimination, as we saw, get filed in the US at least. Higher organizational commitment and satisfaction and lower turnover intention. So inclusive climates are really important. And we also, I mentioned managers. We know that if the manager sends the message that this person is in the in-group, it's a higher fit between skills and the demands of the job, a higher sense of empowerment, fairer treatment, higher organizational commitment, again, lower turnover. So addressing these barriers are really important. We know that it can change attitudes in that workplace, not just for the person with a disability, but it sends a message about workplace culture that's quite pervasive. Because people with disabilities represent not just one minority, they're a part of all the rest of the minority groups. There are women with disabilities, there are ethnic racial minorities with disabilities. So when we are integrating people with disabilities, we are sending messages about equitable access to all the other minority populations in our workplace. There are a number of employer groups like I mentioned our USBLN in the US. There's an employers forum in the UK that as a group of employers, and they are pioneering these kinds of approaches. They're really sending the message across their employer groups and employer-to-employer conversations about encouraging businesses to think in terms of fairness and the capability and investment in human capital rather than just reaching quotas, which many of us have quotas. It's a good reason to try to respond, but it's not the best reason. Changing employer attitudes improve chances of promotion and advancement, we know, and increased education about employment legislation is also associated with more positive attitudes, but messages about inclusion are equally as important, not just legislation. I also want to mention what people with disabilities themselves. Most of the research I've shared with you so far is from the voice of HR professionals. And since many of you here are HR professionals, I wanted to share that perception with you. It comes from your peers, your professional peers in the United States. But I also think it's important for us to hear from the voice of people with disabilities what works and what doesn't work for them. And I mentioned it a little bit because I talked about the feedback about inclusive environments. But we also went to a national association to get feedback from people with disabilities. And those of you who represent the interests of people with disabilities here, I want you to know that we take that serious as well. We focused on emerging issues that we perceived, and one of those issues in the United States, because we're asking companies to start to count people with disabilities, as you saw, we're telling them about these metrics, is that many people who don't have obvious disabilities choose not to disclose. And we know that companies are concerned about that. If they're being asked to count, what do they do for people who don't have obvious disabilities? And choose, because of concerns about discrimination, to not disclose. So we asked people, what should we do about that? And these people with disabilities, and there was over 800 of them from our American Association of People with Disabilities, it's a national association, about 600, I stand corrected, said, here are important factors in workplaces that make a difference, that make them feel like they can talk about their disability and not have discrimination occur as a result of that. They may have to do it because they need an accommodation. So that's one of the things that make them ask, that makes them come out and talk about a disability. They may do it, this is a very good reason, I think, because they have a good supervisor relationship. I thought that was very encouraging, that about 2/3 of them say that this is a reason to disclose. Disability-friendly workplace. So I mentioned that CEO message. This is where that pays off. The CEO is telling us this is a disability-friendly workplace. Active disability recruiting. It's obvious to people that this is a work-friendly place, a disability-friendly place, when they know you are affirmatively recruiting people with disabilities. Knowing of other successes, colleagues who shared about their disability even when it wasn't obvious, and they had a very good experience. They see disability in the diversity statement. This tells them this is the right culture to disclose. And it may be like the first one, that it's because they want an opportunity to advance. They perhaps perceive that the climate is disability friendly, and they feel that they want that job, but they might need an accommodation, and they're willing to come out and talk about it because they want a chance to get that advancement, and they know they need the accommodation to do so. Here's some other things. They tell us that flexible workplace opportunities is a reason to disclose. Disability awareness or anti-stigma training. They go through supervisor training or coworker training, and they know that that workplace is trying to change attitudes. They see HR personnel who are familiar with disabilities and accommodations and understand that it's a goal of the company. They know that the employer has a fair system in place to resolve complaints. So if they make a bid for a job and they get, because of a disability, they get not chosen, they feel that they've got a place to go and talk about it. So those are reasons to disclose. Here are some things to be aware of, because this is what people said, this is where, when I wouldn't feel comfortable disclosing. It's a workplace that they feel there's a risk of being fired or not hired. And 3/4 of these people said this is a reason to not disclose. The employer may focus on the disability. They're concerned that if they talk about it, that the employers are just going to think about that going forward. They are afraid to lose health care. Health care may be a big reason to stay in that job, so rather than rock the boat, they don't disclose about the disability or the need for accommodation because they're afraid to lose their benefits. Fear of limiting their opportunities if they disclose. Supervisor, already they know, is not very supportive. They don't want to tell them about something that might make them discriminate. Their fear of being treated differently or being viewed differently, and they don't feel that if they tell, perhaps that it's going to make any difference on their ability to get advancement. Or they may just tell, but this is the minority. Interestingly, only about a quarter say a desire for privacy. So there's many other reasons other than just privacy that people choose not to disclose. These are things that tell us that this is not an inclusive workplace. If people are fearful, it means that they're somehow being sent the message that this is not a safe place to be who you are in this work environment. So those are things we want to pay attention to. So here's a way to create an environment that encourages disclosure, and this is from what people tell us in the survey. They say, actively recruit people with disabilities, conduct disability awareness training for the staff, enact flexible workplace policies, part-time work, working at home, flex place, maybe opportunities to, if people need medical treatment or need some kind of therapy, having fair systems to address complaints so people can articulate their concerns in a safe environment, creating accessible workplaces, and that's physical access, that's internet access, fostering supportive supervisor-staff relationships, including disability and diversity statements. These are all ways we send the message, easy ways to send the message that this is an inclusive workplace. These are things we've been told we want to avoid. Focusing on disability, whether that's in interviews, when you are bringing people into the workplace, or performance appraisals, not focusing on that. Instead, treating people with disabilities differently in relation to how you interact with them, their opportunities for advancement, performance reviews, or hiring and termination. And so in closing, I've gone very quickly through lots of material. I want to talk about what this means for each of us. And I think we have representatives here from these different organizations, so I've come with some ideas for each of us. Employers, employer networks, for grassroots disability advocacy organizations or NGOs, and for universities. And again, this will be a re-articulation on these things, so pardon my re-emphasizing these, but the number one thing is developing partnerships with local employment agencies, and also with your universities and schools and training programs. They're already your pipeline for new talent, and you can easily take advantage of them. But also go to your NGOs, because they will provide a different talent pool for you. Hiring people with disabilities is not enough just to have the pipeline and make those accommodations. Set up disability management programs, because not only will that be helpful for some of your people with disabilities who are aging, but also for your workforce who never had a disability before, and now as they're aging, will be acquiring disabilities. Ensure that your managers and your HR staff are familiar with not only the legal requirements about accommodation and non-discrimination, but also inclusive environments. We want to send that even more nuanced message to people. Strive to become a model employer, because it's you that will make a difference. You as individual professionals in your own work environment, but you as employer representatives talking to other employer representatives. You are the most persuasive allies we have to make a difference in this. Not me, it comes from you, because your employer peers will listen to you the most quickly. If you have good experiences, if you have cutting edge initiatives, they will want to do what you're doing. You are our persuasive elements out there in this community, so we want you to be those advocates for us, here in your own communities and nationally, because we know many of you are leaders across a number of arenas. Here's what our grassroots organizations, our NGOs, can do. Advocate in your communities for equitable opportunity for people with disabilities in training, because it's the training that's going to make them to be qualified candidates. And if you don't have it in your mainstream employment, your mainstream training opportunities, then you're going to need to make them qualified candidates by providing that training yourself. Support community-based rehabilitation to develop those skills. When an informal economy is predominant, promote micro-enterprise and self-employment. That's more true in our rural areas. Support development of networks of people with disabilities so they can promote their own self-empowerment, and work with employers. I've mentioned that. You need to be reaching out to your employer corporate partners. engage other workers and trade unionists in disability advocacy. Unions can certainly be our partners in this. I didn't mention much about that, but coming from a school of industrial and labor relations, I can tell you we work with unions to be advocates on these issues as well. And for those of us who are here from universities, how many, I'm assuming a few university representatives are here. Am I right about that? So this is for you. Host forums for policymakers, government officials, employers, and other thought leaders, and we have a university representing this today, and that's great because that's exactly the kind of thing we should be doing. Promote better data collection and conduct research on the workplace and also on the efficacy of these interventions, because by gathering data, it gives us a much more persuasive argument, and our universities can be fantastic allies and partners in working with you as companies to get you the information you need so that you can change your own workplaces, but also be advocates to other employers. And educate tomorrow's professionals across all disciplines on disability issues. It's not just, and we've certainly learned this in our own school, we are not a disability-focused school, but we're so excited about being where we are because we are training HR professionals. Those 900 undergraduates that I told you that we train, those are the HR professionals of the future in America. And we spend our time in that college with these young people because we know that they will be the yous of tomorrow. And they will be hopefully informed about disability, and this will be just a natural part of what they see as an inclusive, diverse workplace. So educating professionals, HR professionals, engineers, accountants, educating all of our young professionals about the importance of disability inclusion is an important role for universities to play. So this is what we can do together. This is why I'm excited to be with you here today. We need to keep learning from each other. We need to educate employers globally. I ask you to be my allies, our allies in that. Empower people with disabilities as leaders and advocates. They need to be a part of that voice. Impact public policy. I know many of you are in arenas you can help us do that. Educate the professionals of tomorrow across all disciplines. And that's it. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention. You've been a fantastic audience, and now I want to learn from you. Let's have some time to share. Thank you.
Any questions?
And I didn't mention, I do have some materials up here if you have any interest. I have information about a supervisor training program that we have and about some materials on inclusive environment. We have a lot on our website. So any of you have an interest, you take my email and follow up with me. I'm happy to have you get these materials, but get other materials from us in the future. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Ratnadar. I'm looking at the accessibility initiatives in Wipro software, internal software. In your slide, you mentioned that diabetes and heart diseases is also a part of what you said, people with disabilities. But in our part of the world, we never associated with that. Okay, and also what we are seeing is that India will soon have an explosion of diabetes and heart diseases. So why do you say that these two, especially these two diseases, as a part of people with disability that you are going to do a research on? What is the impetus for that?
That's a great question. It's become more of an issue for us. And you're right, traditionally I think even in the US we did not think about these populations. We were more thinking about people who never had an opportunity to be in the workplace, and we were trying to get them into the workplace. But what we have seen over the course of 20 years is that people with these conditions are disproportionately discharged from the workplace. If a person has had diabetes or a person has had a chronic heart condition, the supervisor gives up on them rather than accommodates. So it has made us more aware that these are issues that need to be included. And so we have more cases, we have more legal cases that are being tried in those areas. And as we have an aging workforce, we're seeing many more HR professionals coming to us and asking the question, how do you accommodate a person who has acquired diabetes, in other words? And so we educate around the importance of allowing that person to have maybe little snacks at their desk or give themselves insulin. And historically, supervisors just didn't know what to do with that. They became alarmed. They said, we can't have that. You're not allowed to step away from the line or your desk. And they would release the person, fire the person, rather than accommodate. So we're educating because that's wrong. We don't want to lose people with diabetes from the workforce for lack of education. And the same way with heart conditions. So we've seen that people who have a heart condition perhaps would get released or fired disproportionately more quickly than other workers because a supervisor begins to think, well, I can't give them lots of work, they can't handle stress, and so we're educating. That's not the right thing to do. Have I answered your question? Thank you. Other questions? Any other questions?
Got it. My name is Vivek Agrawal. I co-head the Disability Forum in Goldman Sachs. Now, I've just been associated with disability for the last 2 years. One thing I'm finding out, just with collaboration, just with what we have across, can itself make a huge difference. I mean, even the metrics you shared today and all this research work. Do you have a list of social media sites or collaboration tools, forums, where all of us can become part of and at least have a platform where we share things? We can share things more globally. Locally, CII has launched a chapter to bring everyone together.
Let's talk about that. We have information that mostly goes out. We have extensive websites for employers with resources on it, but we haven't created an environment, not for the private sector. We have one for the federal sector, U.S. federal sector, interestingly. But let's talk about that, because we are partnered, Goldman Sachs is, I think, a member of the conference board. Is that right? Yes. So, one of the things we could do is perhaps partner with an organization like the conference board and create a forum like that, because I think you're right. Sharing with each other is such a way to learn so quickly and to create a proliferation of good ideas. So I appreciate your question, and I'm going to give that some thought. And we've worked with Goldman Sachs in the U.S., and I think we should be talking about that. So thank you for that. Yes.
Hi, I'm Subhaya from Enable India. So we are an NGO working for people with disability.
Yes.
You had mentioned something about the certification process the Business Leadership Network does for some small and medium enterprises. And could you give us some more input so that probably we can try doing it here also?
I'd be happy to do that. What would be good is either give me your card or email me. And my email address is my initials, S as in Sam, M as in Mary, B as in boy, 23 at cornell.edu. But if you give me your card, or I'll give you my card. I have a card in Braille. And ask me so I can send you that information. But they're just starting. It's just 2 years old. Their businesses come to them. They have to meet certain criteria. They have to have a certain budget. They have to have a business plan. They have to really have their act together as a small business. They certify that, and then companies can be more confident that they're a good provider. I mean, that's basically what we're trying to do, is make sure this is a solid business, so when we send them to companies, the companies can feel confident that they know what they're doing. So that's the process that they have begun, and they would love to talk with you. I'm sure they'd be quite excited to know that there was interest here, so I would love to put you in touch with them.
Sure. So another thing I just want to, out of my curiosity, I'm asking, is there any inclusion kind of cases you can share with some examples? A person with disability you had included, say for example in the fun events and in the meetings or conference calls and all those things. Is there any other inclusion examples or you can share?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Other inclusion examples in workplaces?
Yeah, workplaces. How do you include, when we talk about hiring, that is a separate topic, but when they actually come into the workplace, the inclusion becomes much more tough actually. So is there any other, apart from the legal cases I'm asking, is there any other things you would like to share?
There are certainly many legal cases. As I mentioned, half of our discrimination claims are on alleged unlawful discharge. So you are correct that inclusion is an issue, and we see it in our statistics in that people say that they're disproportionately pushed from the workplace, that people with disabilities themselves feel that they're the first ones to be let go, and they're right. Our national trend data, our national data would tell us that that's correct. When we have an economic recession and when companies downsize, people with disabilities are disproportionately the first group to go, and they're disproportionately the last group to be reabsorbed in the workforce. So we do economic trend data as well, so that we can look at the big picture of the country. So we get this, most of the message, most of what I've been sharing with you is at the workplace or company level, but we also know in the big picture, people with disabilities are let go sooner. So that's, to some extent, that's part of the retention issue that we see, and it's a part of the inclusion issue because it's discrimination once the person's in the workplace. Am I answering your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
This is Vidya from Enable India here. Actually, I would like to know a little bit more if you have some more case studies about discrimination. I have few because we work with a lot of employers extensively, pre-placement and also post-placement actually. So, the couple of ones that maybe I can just share one of them, and then if you have something similar to that which you have experienced, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to hear from you, and also what you have, what kind of actions have you taken on that, right? The recent one that I can share, which is fresh in my mind, is one of the big organizations where they have about I think 4 to 6 people with disabilities actually. So they've been working for last 2 to 2.5 years almost, and obviously that so the families are dependent on these people with disabilities actually. So because most of them are married, and so the organization suddenly comes back and tells us that we need to remove them because that we are launching a new software which could not be probably accessible for people with disabilities, and these are people with vision impairment actually. So I seriously see that as a discrimination actually. So we are still working towards that, So what are such things that you see there in US, and then what kind of actions have been taken on that?
Well, and first of all, I would say visual impairment, because of the advances in technology, are one of the things really we've been most encouraged. We've been able to see people with visual impairments work quite successfully in software companies and computer companies in the technology area. So I would encourage you to try and get information to find out about the adaptability of the software. And often employers are just overwhelmed. They don't take the time to do that research. They don't even know where to begin. So that's again where an NGO, a complementary collaboration is important, because if you could stop the perception on the front end that this isn't a viable job alternative, that would be probably the best thing to do if you can. It's not an uncommon perception, not an uncommon thing that supervisors will just throw up their hands, and when there's a new supervisor, or when there's a change in procedures in a workplace, that people with disabilities will be assumed to not be able to cope, and they don't get that opportunity for the advancement or the training. So, I'm not sure if I'm responding to you. So we have very similar experiences. When we go and do focus groups in the workplace, that's exactly what we hear. People will say, either I've been in the same job for 15 years, 10 years, 20 years, never been given an opportunity to make the change. They assume I can't do it. They never allow me to learn the new software, to go to the new location, to be a part of the new work group, and I'm left behind. And we found that some of the most persuasive things is to be able to create forums where supervisors, and it's touchy to be able to do that, but where supervisors can hear that, and it's shared, and it seems to be making changes, because sometimes they're totally unaware of how discriminatory they have been. They do it for the well-meaning purposes of protecting the person and protecting them in the job, when really it's, it's holding them back. Thank you for your question. Question in the back?
I think you have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you for the nice session. My name is Pratik, and I come from 2 sides in this room. One is I have been volunteering for an organization called Samarthanam, focused on disability, and interestingly I have joined Wipro 2 weeks back. Now, in Samarthanam, apart from any other things, one thing which I find is we have been able to use sports as a tool to enable a lot of visually challenged people. We are actually organizing a T20 Blind World Cup in India, where 10 countries are participating in December. Now, I just want to share and learn with you how in US you have been using sports. Which I hear many stories, but with your experience, how you have been able to use sports as a tool to enable and promote people with disability.
How to use what?
The sports.
Sports?
Yes.
Sports? Is that what you said?
Yes.
To use sports. Sports are actually very powerful. We have worked hard. We have Paralympics in the United States. It's mostly people with physical impairments. It's very well developed now. We have some marvelous Paralympic athletes. We also have what we call Special Olympics, which are more for people with developmental disabilities. They are dispersed throughout the United States. I'd say most communities have Special Olympics. Often they are supported by NGOs, sometimes in collaboration with schools. They are important. I'll start with the Special Olympics. They are important, I think, because they give young people for 2 reasons. They give young people with disabilities an opportunity to compete like they see their non-disabled peers doing. And they learn about teamwork. I mean, how many of us, that's where we learn about how to be good team players, how we learn to collaborate with others, to work in teams, and also how to develop our own physical, well-being and capabilities. So it's important for that reason. It's also important because often Special Olympics is a place where communities learn about disability. We see companies rally around Special Olympics, supporting them. People come out, and it's where they get their exposure. So sports really can be very, very valuable. And we see less our Special Olympics, but more our Paralympics are our national representatives at international competitions. So they serve yet a whole other contribution to global awareness about the competency and proficiency of people with disabilities in the sports world. Am I responding to your question? Thank you. Yeah, we think it's very important. I wish there were more funding. So funding is always an issue, but the private sector is stepping up to help us with keeping these initiatives going. Thank you for the question.
Rather than a question, this is more of an information. My name is Ratnadar, as I told you. I'm also a president of Rotary Bangalore Northwest. I've been a Rotarian for 14 years. What I read in paper, I think about a couple of months back, and unfortunately I lost that particular piece of information. There is a company in Mysore that is about 140 kilometers from here. The CEO of the company is a disabled person, and they specifically recruit disabled people. And this company is into electronic assembly. Okay. What they have found out, when they did the research, is that this company produces quality of the assembly much higher than the tiers, and they get a lot of orders. And the unique selling proposition for them is that they tell that yes, we take pride in employing people with disabilities. I think about 80% of the company is full of people with disabilities from rural area. And this company is now flooded with orders just because of that. Okay. Unfortunately, I couldn't get that particular thing. It came in a vernacular newspaper, and unfortunately lost it. I'm still searching for it, but one day I may get it and I may visit this company. Now, from Rotary, what we have done is this year, that is in the Rotary year starts from July. So from July, We are going to build a new vocational training center specifically for people with disabilities. So that is our charter, and this will be one of the best vocational training centers that in Bangalore that is going to come up. Already, I think we got a funding for about $25,000 for this, and it's going to come up. So once this comes up, not only blind, for all the other type of disabilities, we give training free of charge and give them employment opportunities. So this is one of the initiatives that Rotary has taken this particular year.
That's fantastic. I must say, I have a great deal of respect for Rotary International. I know you do terrific things in every community. I just came from Taiwan, and one of the sponsors of the conference there was Rotary International Taiwan. So thank you for the great work that you do. And I'm heading to Mysore at the end of the day today after our meeting here, so I'll ask around and see if I can get more information about this example. Do you know?
I can help you on that.
Okay.
I think it was with India.
Great. Yes.
He's one of the panelists on our discussion.
Excellent. Great. So see, you have the connection. Thank you for mentioning that. Terrific.
Narendra from India.
He is not disabled.
He's not disabled, yeah.
But the commissioner now is a person with disabilities.
Sorry?
Government of Karnataka, the persons with disabilities, no? The commissioner?
No, he's not.
No?
National Commissioner is
There's a
There's a person who has a hand up behind you.
Chief Commissioner. He is the person.
Hi. Sorry, that's going to be the last question. Dr. Susanne will be available, during high tea, so you can discuss it formally with her. You could just stand up, ladies.
Hi, I'm Nandini. I work with children with visual impairments actually. But I found that a lot of problems also come from self-advocacy. We don't focus much on self-advocacy for people with disabilities. Do you find that's a problem in the States as well, that they're not able to ask for what they need?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's like a global problem. It's not just something we're doing here.
It is a global problem. And it can be a problem. It's interesting. It can be a problem on two levels. Yes, I think, we talked about empowering people and teaching them how to stand up for their own rights. So we certainly all need to do more work on that. And then we find when they happen, because we've had laws in place now for over 20 years for young people with disabilities, so many of them have gone through schools, and we are teaching them about their rights. We're trying to teach them how to assert themselves. But what we find is that because we've trained them a certain way in schools, it's a whole different thing when they go out to the work environment. They don't know how to ask in the work environment. So we may do a good job in schools teaching them how to ask for what they need, but we aren't teaching them how to translate that to appropriate requests in the work environment. They either may be timid and not ask, which is what we're trying to address, or they've been so comfortable asking in school that they go right in with a big wish list, which is not the right thing to do when you're going in for a job. So we have to educate in both ways, teach appropriate self-advocacy once you're an adult, once you're mature in the workplace. What's the right way to ask? So we have work to do there.
Dr. Susanne, one last question.
Okay.
This is Anuradha from the Cheshire Disability Trust. We have seen a whole lot of barriers that you have mentioned in these slides. I just wanted to know, out of curiosity, which has been the toughest barrier, and how would you resolve it? Is there something which you came across during your journey?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. I still think the biggest barrier is attitudes, hands down. It definitely is. People's disability is not the problem. People learn how to accommodate themselves. I mean, we're far more clever than we ever give ourselves credit for. We're an adaptive species, human beings, and people figure out how to deal with disability. It's the impediments in our environments, and the biggest impediment is attitude. We see that, but I can tell you, our HR professionals tell us that themselves. They talk about skills development concerns, which I mentioned to you, and that's not to say that that's not important. We need to get people equitably prepared, But they also tell us that the biggest problem they have in the workplace is attitudes of supervisors and coworkers. That even though they tell people about hiring people with disabilities, the fear factor is still there. So it's the number one thing we need to work on, is educating our workplaces about the appropriate, the importance of integrating people with disabilities and giving them equitable opportunities. So that's really where we've got our work cut out for us. So that's the common mission we all have to have.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Dr.
much for your
Susanne.
attention.
I would like to now request Mr. Basavaraju from GRAM, which is the Grassroots Research and Advocacy Movement, to say a few words.
Good evening all. We usually start all our programs taking the name of Lord Ganpati, Ganesha, because who else can be the more disabled person than Lord Ganesha? Some of us don't have vision, some of us don't have limbs working, but Ganesha, the poor guy, doesn't have his face at all. So taking his name at the end, I would like to thank Professor Susanne for wonderful talk and interaction. So it was very informative and encouraging us to involve in the issue and to do our bit from our side. So thank you very much for taking your time and addressing all of us. On behalf of GRAM and Wipro and Azim Premji Foundation, I thank you. Grassroots Research and Advocacy Movement is an organization, it's a unit of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement. It's a public policy research initiative. We take up grassroots researches led by people, means community-centric, and always try to take it to the logical conclusion of taking it to policy level and advocating with appropriate people at an appropriate level. It's founded on the strong base of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement's 2.5 decades of service to community, and we are following right from the beginning the inclusive education approach, as well as working with community in community-based rehabilitation activities. It was another opportunity for all of us. It's a beginning we consider from behalf of GRAM, we say, because we would now like to take it forward to different advocacy activities, to different people. Apart from this event, we'll be organizing another event in Mysore day after tomorrow, having a panel session, calling people, calling a disability commissioner, having different corporates, and as you mentioned, the people who are actually walking the talk, who are employing disabled people, and what are the advantages and disadvantages, challenges they are facing, so that they can inspire larger corporate world. So we'll be doing that, and we are involved, and I would request organizations involved in this area to support us and to collaborate with us, and also allow us to collaborate with you. So thank you very much for coming here. I thank you each one and all, organizations, civil society organizations, Wipro group of companies and other corporate companies who are present here, for taking your time despite your busy schedule to come here. And I must thank Azim Premji Foundation and Wipro for taking all the measures and pains to organize this event with short notice and making this a successful one. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. We can now proceed to the cafeteria. There's high tea and some snacks served. And Dr. Susanne will be available for discussions as well. So please make use of this opportunity. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hi there.